Great Chinese Famine was one of the deadliest disasters in human history, a crisis that unfolded over several years and left millions of people starving. While the famine itself lasted from the late 1950s to the early 1960s, the roots of this disaster ran deeper than just a few years of bad harvests. To fully understand what happened, we need to look at the events leading up to it, the decisions that shaped it, and the devastating impact it had on the people of China. The famine was not just a natural disaster, it was largely man-made. It all began with the Great Leap Forward, a massive campaign launched by Chairman Mao Zedong in the year 1958. The goal was to rapidly transform China from an agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse. The idea was simple. By collectivizing farms and focusing on large-scale production, China would supposedly be able to produce more food while also increasing steel and industrial output. On paper, this sounded like a bold and ambitious plan, but in reality, it quickly turned into a disaster. One of the most significant changes was the formation of people's communes. These were massive collective farms where private land ownership was abolished, and farmers were forced to work together under government control. The problem was that these communes were not managed efficiently. Farmers were often assigned tasks they had a little experience with, and traditional farming methods were replaced with experimental techniques that did more harm than good. For example, the government promoted a technique called deep plowing, where farmers were instructed to plow deeper into the soil than ever before, believing it would help crops grow better. Instead, it damaged the soil and made it harder for plants to take root. Another issue was close planting, where crops were planted extremely close together under the assumption that it would lead to higher yields. In reality, this caused the plants to compete for nutrients and sunlight, leading to weaker and less productive crops. At the same time, the government insisted on using excessive amounts of fertilizers, many of which were not suitable for the land, further damaging the soil. These policies, combined with unrealistic production targets, led to widespread crop failures. As the situation worsened, local officials felt immense pressure to report success, regardless of reality. Many inflated their production numbers, falsely claiming that record amounts of grain were being harvested. This deception had tragic consequences. Since the central government believed there was a surplus of food, they continued to demand grain from the countryside to supply cities and even export food to other countries. Meanwhile, the rural population who actually grew the food was left with nothing. To make matters worse, nature dealt its own blows. The year 1959 saw severe droughts across major agricultural regions, further reducing crop yields. Then came flooding, which wiped out even more farmland. The combination of misguided policies and natural disasters created the perfect storm for what was about to come. By the end of 1959, food shortages were becoming a reality for millions of people. Farmers who once had control over their own harvests were now entirely dependent on government distribution, and as food supplies dwindled, starvation began to spread. People started to realize that something was terribly wrong, but the government refused to acknowledge the crisis. Propaganda continued to paint an image of success, and any voices of concern were quickly silenced. The stage was set for one of the deadliest famines in history, but at this point, the full extent of the disaster had not yet unfolded. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into how the famine escalated, the desperate measures people took to survive, and the government's response, or lack thereof, as millions began to starve. As the famine worsened in the year 1960, entire communities began to feel the devastating effects of starvation. Food supplies were rapidly diminishing, and for many rural families, the situation became a matter of life and death. Villages that once thrived on agriculture now struggled to find anything edible, and the once hopeful promises of the Great Leap Forward were now seen as empty words. One of the most tragic aspects of the crisis was how the government continued to deny the severity of the situation. Local officials, under immense pressure to show success, kept reporting inflated harvest numbers to higher authorities. These false reports created a deadly cycle. Since the central government believed the countryside had an abundance of food, they continued to take large portions of the harvest for cities, state reserves, and exports. The result was devastating. Rural villages, where the majority of China's population lived, were left with little to nothing to eat. At the same time, strict government policies made it nearly impossible for people to seek food elsewhere. Travel restrictions prevented villagers from leaving their communes to find food in other areas. Those who attempted to leave without permission were often arrested or even executed for defying government orders. The government's grip on information was just as tight. Any discussion of food shortages was seen as a challenge to authority, and those who spoke out were silenced. This created a terrifying situation where people were starving, but the official narrative claimed that everything was improving. Desperation forced people to take extreme measures to survive. Wild plants, tree bark, and even soil became sources of food for those with nothing left. In some cases, villagers dug up old grain husks from the ground, hoping to find any remaining nutrition. Reports from survivors tell of people boiling leather shoes, eating straw, or grinding tree leaves into paste in an effort to stay alive. But these desperate acts were often not enough. Malnutrition spread rapidly, leading to disease, weakness, and death. Adding to the suffering, famine-related diseases began to take hold. When people are severely malnourished, their immune systems weaken, making them more vulnerable to illness. Dysentery, typhoid, and other deadly diseases spread quickly in the weakened population. The lack of proper sanitation and medical care only worsened the crisis. Villages that had once been full of life became eerily quiet, as more and more people succumbed to hunger and disease. Despite the clear signs of a nationwide catastrophe, the government refused to admit the truth. Instead of providing aid, officials doubled down on propaganda, insisting that the famine was either exaggerated or the result of local mismanagement. Some even blamed farmers themselves, accusing them of hoarding food or failing to work hard enough. This denial meant that no real help was given, and millions continued to suffer in silence. By the end of 1960, the death toll had climbed into the tens of millions, but even as entire communities were being wiped out, the worst was still yet to come. In the next part, we'll explore the peak of the famine, the unimaginable lengths people went to in their fight for survival, and how the government's response, or lack of it, sealed the fate of millions. By the year 1961, the Great Chinese Famine had reached its most devastating point. Entire villages had been wiped out, leaving behind abandoned homes, empty fields, and mass graves. The countryside, once filled with hardworking farmers, was now a silent landscape of starvation and suffering. As food supplies ran out completely, people were forced to make impossible choices. In some areas, families resorted to eating clay, sawdust, and even poisonous roots in a desperate attempt to fill their stomachs. Many tried to catch rats, insects, or stray animals, anything that could provide even a small amount of nourishment. But as the famine continued, these sources disappeared as well, leaving people with nothing. Meanwhile, the government's strict control over movement and information only worsened the situation. Farmers were still forbidden from leaving their communes to search for food elsewhere, and the few who attempted to flee were often caught and punished. Many died on the side of roads, their bodies left where they fell, as others were too weak to bury them. The sight of skeletal figures wandering the countryside became tragically common. One of the darkest aspects of the famine was how those in power continued to prioritize politics over human life. Despite millions of deaths, grain exports to other countries continued, and government officials held lavish banquets while their people starved. Farmers, who had once produced food for the entire nation, were now dying in their own fields, surrounded by crops they were not allowed to eat. In urban areas, the effects of the famine were also severe, but city dwellers had slightly more access to government-controlled food supplies. However, rations were barely enough to survive, and only those with political connections or wealth could find additional food on the black market. Even in major cities, reports surfaced of people collapsing from hunger on the streets. As the famine reached its peak, the psychological toll became just as severe as the physical suffering. Families were torn apart as parents struggled to feed their children, and communities that had once relied on cooperation now faced brutal competition for survival. The weight of starvation drove people to desperation, and some were forced to abandon loved ones who could no longer move. Despite the overwhelming evidence of mass starvation, the government refused to acknowledge the full scale of the disaster. Censorship remained strict, and speaking out against the policies that had led to the famine was still considered a crime. Many who dared to criticize the government's handling of the crisis were arrested, silenced, or worse. The truth about what was happening remained hidden from the world and even from many within China itself. But as millions continued to die, cracks began to form in the official narrative. Some local officials, unable to ignore the suffering any longer, started quietly reporting the real conditions in their regions. Behind closed doors, discussions about the famine's true causes and possible solutions began to take place. The leadership was finally being forced to confront the consequences of its policies. In the final part, we'll explore how the famine eventually came to an end, the lasting impact it had on China, and the changes that followed in the years ahead. By the spring of 1962, the Great Chinese Famine had reached its grim climax. The once bustling countryside, home to millions of farmers and their families, had become a land of desolation. Entire villages had been wiped out, and the surviving population was emaciated and broken. The government, which had remained in denial for so long, could no longer ignore the devastating reality. Though the famine was not officially acknowledged until much later, the truth was undeniable. Millions had perished due to a combination of misguided policies, government negligence, and a refusal to adapt to the dire situation. As the famine began to ease, the government finally took some steps to address the crisis. In the wake of mass starvation, the agricultural policies that had caused the disaster were slowly abandoned. The people's communes, which had been central to the Great Leap Forward, were dismantled, and private farming once again became more common. The leadership, recognizing the scale of their failure, began to reverse the collectivization policies that had contributed so heavily to the crisis. But the damage was done. The human toll of the famine was staggering. Estimates of the death toll range widely, but most historians agree that at least 15 million people, and possibly many more, died as a result of the famine. Communities that had once been close-knit and vibrant were shattered, and the psychological scars left by years of suffering would linger for generations. The famine also left a deep and lasting impact on China's political landscape. The disastrous results of the Great Leap Forward severely damaged the credibility of Chairman Mao Zedong and his government. While Mao remained in power for years after the famine ended, the crisis marked the beginning of a slow but steady decline in his authority. His leadership, once seen as infallible, was now questioned by many, though public dissent was still heavily suppressed. Internationally, the famine remained largely hidden from the outside world during its peak. The government's tight control over information meant that the full extent of the crisis was not widely known until years later. In China, the government's official narrative continued to portray the famine as a minor issue, with some even blaming local mismanagement or other scapegoats for the tragedy. It wasn't until the early 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the opening of China's borders, that more open discussions of the famine began to emerge. Even then, it remained a sensitive and controversial topic, and those who sought to confront the government's role in the disaster often faced harsh consequences. As China moved into the post-famine years, recovery was slow. The scars of the famine ran deep, and many survivors struggled with physical and emotional trauma. The agricultural landscape, once ravaged by years of mismanagement, needed years of work to restore. For the people who lived through the famine, the memories of hunger, loss, and fear remained vivid. While the Great Chinese Famine came to an end, its legacy would continue to shape China's policies and its people for years to come. The disaster had exposed the dangers of central planning and political dogma when combined with the refusal to acknowledge reality. For the survivors, the famine was a reminder of the fragile nature of life in a country where political ideologies often came before human needs. In the years that followed, China would experience rapid economic growth and modernization, but the lessons of the famine remained a somber chapter in its history. The Great Leap Forward had promised progress, but instead brought ruin, and the famine that followed remains one of the darkest periods in modern history. Though time has passed, the memory of the Great Chinese Famine endures as a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked government control and the devastating consequences of ignoring human suffering in the pursuit of political goals.